All right, let's go ahead and look at every Major League Baseball player ever whose last name started with the letter D as of May 24th, 2025. We're going to start with John D'Acquisto, Jeff D'Amico, Jamie D'Antoni, Jerry Darcy, Chase D'Armond, Travis D'Arnaud, Omar Dahl, Paul Dade, John DeHarg, Pete Daglia, Angelo Dagres, David Dahl, Jay Dahl, Bill Dahlin, Babe Dahlgren, Jerry Dolke, Casey Daigle, Bill Daly, James Daly, John Daly, Sam Daly, Vince Daly, Con Daly, Ed Daly, Hugh Daly, George Daisy, Bruce Dale Canton, Bobby Dahlbeck, Carl Dale, Gene Dale, Pete Delina, Mark D'Alessandro, Bill Daly, Bud Daly, John Daly, Judd Daly, Matt Daly, Pete Daly, Tom Daly, Eggy Daillard, Porter Dallas, Dom D'Alessandro, Brian Dallimore, Abner Dalrymple, Bill Dalrymple, Clay Dalrymple, Jack Dalton, Mike Dalton, Bert Daly, George Daly, Joe Daly, Son Daly, Tom Daly, Bill Dam, Jack DeMosca, Bill Demmingham, Johnny Damon, Henry Damrue, Katie Dana, Lunia Danage, Ray Danebridge, Troy Danebridge, Pat Dennerkerd, Lee Daney, Dave Danforth, Chuck Daniel, Davis Daniel, Jack Daniel, Daniels, Benny Daniels, Bert Daniels, Charlie Daniels, Eddie Daniels, Fred Daniels, George Daniels, Jack Daniels, Jim Daniels, Kai Daniels, Law Daniels, Pepper Daniels, Pete Daniels, Tony Daniels, Tyler Danish, John Danks, Jordan Danks, Buck Daner, Hagen Danner, Harry Danning, Ike Danning, John D'Antonio, Babe Danzing, Cliff Dapper, George Davey, Pat Darcy, Victor Ensberg, Cliff Derringer, Rolla Derringer, Al Dark, Del Darling, Ron Darling, Bob Darnell, James Darnell, Logan Darnell, Mike Dar, Jack Darrow, Michael Darrell Hicks, George Darrow, Yu Darvish, who just retired last year, Bobby Darwin, Donnie Darwin, Jeff Darwin, Doug DeCenzo, Willie Dashiell, Lee Dashner, Dalzler, Frank Dasso, Jeff Datz, Dan Dow, Brian Dowbuck, Harry Daubert, Jake Daubert, Rich Daubert, Harold Doherty, Jack Doherty, Bob Daughters, Darren Dalton, Hooks Douse, Pompey Davillio, Vic Davillio, Jeff Davoon, Jerry Devanin, Claude Davenport, Dave Davenport, Jim Davenport, Joe Davenport, Lloyd Davenport, Lum Davenport, Mike Davey, Tom Davey, Ray DeViolti, Andre Davidson, Bill Davidson, Bob Davidson, Charlie Davidson, Claude Davidson, Cletus Davidson, Daniel Davidson, Dave Davidson, Homer Davidson, Mark Davidson, Matt Davidson, Ted Davidson, Tucker Davidson, Jerry Davey, Chuck Davies, George Davies, Kyle Davies, Zach Davies, Davis, Al Davis, Albert Davis, Alvin Davis, Austin Davis, Babe Davis, Ben Davis, Big Boy Davis, Bill Davis, Blake Davis, Bob Davis, Brad Davis, Brandy Davis, Brendan Davis, Brock Davis, Bud Davis, Butch Davis, Davis, Chili Davis, Chris Davis, Crash Davis, Kurt Davis, Daisy Davis, Dick Davis, Dixie Davis, Doug Davis, Earl Davis, Eric Davis, Frank Davis, G. Davis, George Davis, Hall of Famer, George Davis, not Hall of Famer, Jerry Davis, Glenn Davis, Goldie Davis, Harry Davis, Henry Davis, active, Horace Davis, Ike Davis, Ira Davis, JD Davis, JJ Davis, Jack Davis, Jackie Davis, Jason Davis, Jalen Davis, Jim Davis, Jody Davis, Joel Davis, John Davis, Johnny Davis, Jonathan Davis, Jumbo Davis, Kane Davis, Chris Davis, Kiddo Davis, L Davis, Lance Davis, Lee Davis, Lefty Davis, Leyland Davis, Mark Davis, Mike Davis, Noah Davis, Odie Davis, Oscar Davis, Odie Davis, Preacher Davis, Peanut Davis, Piper Davis, Preacher Davis, Raha Davis, Robert Davis, Ron Davis, Rookie Davis, Roosevelt Davis, Russ Davis, Satchel Davis, Saul Davis, Sherman Davis, Spencer Davis, Steel Arm Davis, Steve Davis, Storm Davis, Taylor Davis, Tim Davis, Todd Davis, Tommy Davis, Trench Davis, Virgil Davis, Wade Davis, Willie Davis, William Davis, Willie Davis, Woody Davis, Mike Davidson, Scott Davison, Travis Dawkins, Bill Dawley, Joey Dollar, Andre Dawson, Hall of Famer, Joe Dawson, Johnny Dawson, Leroy Dawson, Rex Dawson, Ronnie Dawson, Day, Bill Day, Boots Day, Connie Day, Dewin Day, Leon Day, Hall of Famer, P. Ridge Day, Zach Day, Brian Day, Ken Daly, Grant Dayton, Jonathan Daza, Alejandro Deaza, Jordanel De Caster, Justin DeFrodis, Brett DeGoose, Alex DeGoody, Angel De Jesus, Emmanuel De Jesus, Ivan De Jesus, Jose De Jesus, Chase De Jong, Jordan De Jong, Brian De La Cruz, Ellie De La Cruz, Frankie De La Cruz, Joel De La Cruz, Tommy De La Cruz, Mikel De La Hoz, Rolanda De La Meza, Dane De La Rosa, Yuri De La Rosa, Francisco De La Rosa, Jesus De La Rosa, Jorge De La Rosa, Ruby De La Rosa, Tomas De La Rosa, Jose De La Rosa, Jorge De Leon, Jose De Leon, Abel De Los Santos, Eniel De Los Santos, Fantino De Los Santos, Luis De Los Santos, Luis De Los Santos, Luis De Los Santos, Raymond De Los Santos, Velio De Los Santos, Yuri De Los Santos, Jorge De Paula, Jose De Paula, Julio De Paula, Cole DeVries, Ron Deagle, Roger Diago, Charlie Deal, Cop Dealer, Jojo Dealer, Lindsay Deal, Snake Deal, Pat Dealey, Austin Dean, Bill Dean, Bobby Dean, Charles Dean, Chubby Dean, Dizzy Dean, Hall of Famer, Dory Dean, Harry Dean, Nelson Dean, Pat Dean, Paul Dean, Robert Dean, Tommy Dean, Waylon Dean, Alphaeus Dean, Harry Dean, Buddy Deer, Charlie DeArmond, Yank Diaz, John Deasley, Pat Deasley, Dennis DeBar, Hank DeBerry, Joe DeBerry, Roy Devon, Adam DeBoose, David Buchette, Art Decatur, Doug Cicines, Cody Decker, Dusty Decker, Frank Decker, George Decker, Harry Decker, Jeff Decker, Joe Decker, Marty Decker, Steve Decker, Lionel DeCour, Artie Dead, Rod Dedew, Russ Dedew, Jeff Dedman, Jim Dedrick, Sam Dedoon, Jim D, Shorty D, Bill Deegan, Rob Deere, John Deering, Charlie Dees, Dean Dietz, Tony DeFate, Aurora De Friedes, Mark DeGrerick, Roop DeGroff, Jacob DeGrom, active still, Corey DeHaan, Rick DeHart, Herman Dellum, Greg Dykem, Jim Diebel, Odo DeBinger, Pat Diesel, Dyson, Bill Dietrich, Mike DeJean, David DeJesus, Mark DeJean, Paul DeJean, Bill DeConing, Adrian Del Castillo, Bobby Del Greco, Miguel De Pozo, Ennerio Del Rosario, Garton Del Savio, Miguel de Toro, Steve Delabar, Ed Delahanty, Hall of Famer Frank Delahanty, Jim Delahanty, Joe Delahanty, Tom Delahanty, Bill Delancey, Art Delaney, Bill Delaney, Bob Delaney, Jason DeLay, Manny DeClarum, Jose De Leon, Luis De Leon, Alex Delgado, Carlos Delgado, File Delgado, Jesus Delgado, Luis Delgado, Randall Delgado, Wilson Delgado, Flame Deli, Juan Dallas, Eddie Delker, Weezer Dell, David DeLucci, Jason Delario, Brett Delmas, Nikki Delmonico, Zach Deloach, Ike Deloach, Jim Dicing, John DeLuca, Rich DeLuca, Ben DeLuzio, Joe DeMastri, Fred DeMaris, Al DeMartri, Frank DeMaria, Chris DeMaria, Billy DeLamars, Sam Demmel, John McDerritt, Travis DeMerty, Art Demery, Larry Demery, Don Demeter, Steve Demeter, Harry DeMiller, Ray Demmett, Don DeMolia, Gene DeMontreville, Lee DeMontreville, Bingo DeMoss, Ben Demont, Con Dempsey, Mark Dempsey, Rick Dempsey, Ryan Dempster, Matt Van Decker, Bill Dennehy, Travis Denker, Brian Denham, Todd Dennehy, Kyle Denneher, Orion Dennick, Otto Denning, Dennings, Doc Dennings, Den Dennis, Jerry Denny, John Denny, Chris Denota, Drew Denson, Bucky Dent, Eddie Dent, Sam Dent, Roger Denzer, Mike DePanger, Joe DePastino, Sean DePaula, Tony DePhillips, Gene Derby, George Derby, Matt Dermody, Bob Deemer, Mark DeRosa, Claude Derrick, Mike Derrick, Paul Derringer, Jim Barrington, Russ Derry, Shorty Desherdian, Joe Desa, Matt DeSalvo, Gene DeSautis, Daniel DeScalo, Anthony DeSclafani, Jim DeShalis, DeShield, Delino DeShields, Jimmy DeShong, John DeSilva, Ian Desmond, Ojamar Dufspiang, Rube DeSau, Elmer Dessens, Ortestos Destrade, Bob Detheridge, Reed Detmers, George Detor, John Detmer, Tom Detor, Ducky Detweller, Russ Detweller, Mel Douche, Cesar Devares, Charlie Devens, Chris Devensky, Mike Devereaux, Jose Devers, Raphael Devers, Adrian Devine, Joey Devine, Mickey Devine, Hal Delvini, Bernie DeViveros, Art Delvin, Jim Delvin, Rex Devote, Doug DeVore, Josh Dieter, Al DeVormer, Walt DeVoy, Charlie DeWald, Mark Dewey, Jeff Dewis, Blake Dewitt, Fred Dewitt, Matt Dewitt, Samuel Dewitt, Charlie Dexter, Zach D. Zenzo, Kermit Dial, Louis Dialis, Scott Diamond, Thomas Diamond, Almidi Diaz, Alex Diaz, Alexis Diaz, Argenis Diaz, Bo Diaz, Carlos Diaz, Dejan Diaz, Eddie Diaz, Edgar Diaz, Edwin Diaz, Einer Diaz, Elias Diaz, Felix Diaz, Fernando Diaz, Heliodro Diaz, Isan Diaz, Jaro Diaz, Jonathan Diaz, Jordan Diaz, Jose Diaz, Juan Diaz, Jambo Diaz, Luan Diaz, Mario Diaz, Matt Diaz, Miguel Diaz, Mike Diaz, Pedro Diaz, Robinson Diaz, Rufino Diaz, Victor Diaz, Yanner Diaz, Yandi Diaz, Yensi Diaz, Yilber Diaz, Yunciel Diaz, Rob Dibble, Pedro DeBolt, Paul Dickin, Leo Dickerman, Alex Dickerson, Buttercup Dickerson, Chris Dickerson, Corey Dickerson, George Dickerson, Bill Dickey, George Dickey, R.A. Dickey, Stillarm Dickey, Emerson Dickman, Johnny Dickshot, Brandon Dixon, Jason Dixon, Jim Dixon, Lance Dixon, Murray Dixon, Okea Dixon, Watt Dixon, Bob Ettier, Ernie Dell, George Deal, Philip Deal, Jake Dykeman, Chuck Deerling, Larry Dierker, Bill Deerch, Derek Deerch, Dick Dietz, Lloyd Dietz, Roy Detzel, Jay Defani, Mark DeFilis, Mike DeFilis, Wilmer Defoe, Ben Diggins, Reese Diggs, Steve Digman, Martin Diggler, Jack Delario, Dillard, Don Dillard, Gordon Dillard, Lamon Dillard, Pat Dillard, Steve Dillard, Tim Dillard, Pickles Dill, Hofer, Bob Dillinger, Harley Dillinger, Bill Dillman, Frank Dillon, Joe Dillon, John Dillon, Packy Dillon, Steve Dillon, Miguel Dillon, Joe DiMaggio, John DiMaggio, Vince DiMaggio, Edwin Dimes, Frank DiMichele, Mike Dimmel, Lenny DiNardo, Carrie Dinnan, Van Stinges, Joe DiMaggio's in the Hall of Fame, Dylan Dingler, Craig Digman, Nick Deeney, Brian Dinkelman, Bill Deenan, Ron Diorio, Rob DiPietro, Frank DiPino, Marcus Diplon, Jerry DiPoto, 1993 to 2007, current Mariners general manager, Jimmy DeRoe, Andy Dirks, Gary Discarnio, George Dersh, Glenn Dishman, Dizzy DeSmooks, Alex DeSona, Benny Stificello, George DeSell, Art Dittmer, Jack Dittmer, Frank Diven, Moxie Davis, Dixon, Brandon Dixon, Eddie Dixon, George Dixon, Glenn Dixon, Johnny Bob Nixon, Ken Dixon, Leo Dixon, Paul Dixon, Rap Dixon, Sonny Dixon, Steve Dixon, Tom Dixon, Brett Dlugock, Bill Doak, Walt Doan, John Dobb, Dan Dobick, Hunter Dobbins, Greg Dobbs, John Dobbs, Ray Dobbins, Jess Dobemerk, Randy Dobnark, Chuck Dobson, Joe Dobson, Pat Dobson, Larry Doby, Hall of Famer, George Dawkins, Dylan Dodd, Ona Dodd, Robert Dodd, Tom Dodd, John Dodge, Sam Dodge, Pat Dodson, Fred Doe, Bobby Dower, Hall of Famer, Ed Donahue, John Doherty, Scott Donham, Kyle Dohey, Biddy Dolan, Cozy Dolan, Joe Dolan, John Dolan, Tom Dolan, Lester Dole, Raphael Dolis, Frank Doljic, Art Dole, Chase Dollander, Freddie Dolce, Chris Dominguez, Jason Dominguez, Jose Dominguez, Juan Dominguez, Justo Dominguez, Matt Dominguez, Sir Anthony Dominguez, Andy Dominique, Deacon Donahue, Jigs Donahue, Dan Donahue, John Donahue, Pat Donahue, Red Donahue, She Donahue, Tim Donahue, Atlee Donahue, Jason Donald, Ed Donalds, John Donaldson, Josh Donaldson, Len Donder, Donnelly, Mike Donnelly, Bex Donnelly, Brendan Donnelly, Ed Donnelly, Frank Donnelly, Jim Donnelly, John Donnelly, Pete Donnelly, Chris Donalds, Alexander Donahue, Jim Donahue, Pete Donahue, Tom Donahue, Lito Donosco, Bill Donovan, Brendan Donovan, Dick Donovan, Fred Donovan, Jerry Donovan, Mike Donovan, Patsy Donovan, Tom Donovan, Red Doohan, Mickey Doolin, Sean Doolittle, Harry Dooms, John Dobson, Bill Doran, John Doran, Tom Doran, Jerry Morgan, Mike Dorgan, Freach, Dorish, Charlie Doman, Red Dorman, Dusty Dorn, Gus Dormer, Brian Barrow, Brett Dorr, Brian Dorset, Carl Dorset, Jim Dorsey, Joseph Dorsey, Luis Dorsey, Melvin Dorda, Herm Dozier, Jack Dozier, David Doster, Octavio Dotel, Dotson, Richard Dotson, Gary Daughter, Dutch Daughter, Babe Dottie, Felix Drubont, Charlie Doherty, Jim Doherty, Patsy Doherty, Tom Doherty, Jesse Douglas, John Douglas, Larry Douglas, Phil Douglas, Whammy Douglas, the Syntax Douglas, Eddie Douglas, Klondike Douglas, Sean Douglas, Ryan Domit, Charlie Dolit, Camilo Duvall, Dennis Dove, Clarence Dowd, Josh Dowd, Skip Dowd, Snooks Dowd, Tommy Dowd, Kyle Dowdy, Ken Dowell, Joe Downey, Dave Dowling, Pete Dowling, Red Downey, Tom Downey, Al Downing, Brian Downing, Bunny Downs, Darren Downs, Dave Downs, Jeter Downs, Kelly Downs, Matt Downs, Red Downs, Scott Downs, Tom Dowse, Brenton Boyle, Brian Doyle, Carl Doyle, Connie Doyle, Danny Doyle, Donnie Doyle, Denny Doyle, Jack Doyle, Jacob Doyle, Jeff Doyle, Jesse Doyle, Jess Doyle, Jim Doyle, John Doyle, Larry Doyle, Paul Doyle, Slow Joe Doyle, Tommy Doyle, Carl Doyle, Corey Doyle, Brian Dozier, Buzz Dozier, DJ Dozier, Hunter Dozier, Tom Dozier, Doug Drabick, Kyle Drabick, Mo Drabowski, Dick Drago, Brian Draham, Andy Drake, Bill Drake, Delos Drake, Larry Drake, Logan Drake, Lyman Drake, Oliver Drake, Renardo Drake, Sammy Drake, Solly Drake, Tom Drake, Kelly Dreswell, Mike Trapper, Drake Drabby, Dravecki, Tom Drees, Bill Tresson, Darren Dryfort, Clem Drysworld, Valentine Drake, Bill Drescher, Ryan Dress, Truck Dressen, Lee Dressen, Kirk Dessendorfer, Bob Dresser, Rob Dressler, Cameron Drew, J.D. Drew, Stephen Drew, Tim Drew, William Drew, Frank Drews, Carl Drews, Drac Dreyer, Steve Dreyer, Dan Dryson, Lou Drill, Dennis Driscoll, Denny Driscoll, Jim Driscoll, Logan Driscoll, Michael Driscoll, Patty Driscoll, Travis Driscoll, Mike Driscoll, Tom Drone, Ralph Drop, Dick Drop, Lewis Druckle, Carl Druhot, Drummer, Tim Drummond, Keith Drumright, Brandon Drury, John Drysdale, Hall of Famer, Claro Duani, Daniel Duarte, Monk, Dubiel, Sean Dubin, Brian Dubois, Jason Dubois, Mauricio Dubon, Eric Dubose, John Dubuque, Rob Dookie, Justin Dusitter, Marlon Duckett, Brandon Duckworth, Jim Duckworth, Eddie Ducey, Ralph Ducey, Lucas Duda, Cly Studley, Doc Dudley, Ed Dudley, John Dudra, Brian Dusing, Hal Deuce, Cecil Duff, Ernest Duff, Matt Duff, Pat Duff, Jim Duffalo, Charlie Duffy, Tyler Duffy, John Duffy, Bernie Duffy, Bill Duffy, Chris Duffy, Danny Duffy, Eddie Duffy, Frank Duffy, Hugh Duffy, Matt Duffy. Hugh Duffy's in the Hall of Fame. Matt Duffy, Bill Dugan, Dan Dugan, Ed Dugan, Joe Dugan, Gus Dugan, Don Dugdale, Oscar Doogie, Jim Dugan, Steve Duger, Robert Duggar, Bill Duggleby, Martin Duke, Zach Duke, Elijah Dukes, Jan Dukes, Tom Dukes, Tommy Dukes, Luis Dula, Rob Dula, Ryan Dole, Lafayette Dumas, Phil Dumarada, George Dumont, Dan Dubin, Nick Dermovich, Bill Dumpson, Joe Denard, Matt Dunbar, Tom Dunbar, Vet Dunbar, Chris Duncan, Courtney Duncan, Dave Duncan, Frank Duncan, Jeff Duncan, Jim Duncan, Joe Duncan, Mariano Duncan, Pat Duncan, Shelley Duncan, Taylor Duncan, Vern Duncan, Ed Dundon, Gus Dundon, Jim Dunnigan, Sam Dunnigan, Lee Dunham, Willie Dunham, Davey Dunkel, Charles Duncan, Bill Dunlap, Fred Dunlap, Grant Dunlap, Herman Dunlap, Jack Dunleavy, George Dunlap, Adam Dunn, Alifos Dunn, Blake Dunn, Jack Dunn, Jake Dunn, Jim Dunn, Joe Dunn, Justin Dunn, Mike Dunn, Oliver Dunn, Ron Dunn, Scott Dunn, Steve Dunn, Todd Dunn, Mike Dunn, Andy Dunning, Dane Dunning, Jake Dunning, Steve Dunning, Parker Dunshee, Shawan Dunstan, Todd Dunwoody, Frank Dupree, John Duplanter, Mike Dupree, Carlos Duran, Dan Duran, Ezekiel Duran, Herman Duran, Jaron Duran, Johan Duran, Roberto Duran, Luis Durango, Mike Durant, Manatello Durapau, Rubio Durazo, Blaine Durbin, Caleb Durbin, Chad Durbin, JD Durbin, Ryan Durbin, Bull Durham, Don Durham, Ed Durham, James Durham, Joe Durham, Leon Durham, Ray Durham, Robbie Durham, George Durning, Rich Durning, Jason DeRocher, Lee DeRocher, Hall of Famer, Nick Durton, Red Durnett, Tread Durrington, Cedric Durst, Jesse Driea, Irv Dusek, Carl Deucer, Bob Dustle, Adam Duvall, Mike Duvall, Bill Duzin, Al Dwight, Eddie Dwight, Chris Dwyer, Frank Dwyer, Dwim Dwyer, Dwight Dwyer, Dry Dwyer, Jerry Dubinsky, Jim Dick, Jermaine Dye, Ben Dyer, Buffy Dyer, Eddie Dyer, Mike Dyer, Jimmy Dygert, William Dyke, AJ Dykes, Jimmy Dykes, Rod Hems Dykoff, Alan Dykstra, Lenny Dykstra, John Dreiler, Jared Dyson, and Sam Dyson. And this was taken in one take. Wow, I didn't think I'd do that. That's over 1,100 names.
And again, thank you for tuning into the videos. Don't forget that you can also see me on Patreon at Sammy5436, where it's $1 a month. I also am seeable on Instagram at Sammy5436. TikTok at Sammy5436. I'm on Blue Sky at Sammy5436, though I don't use that often. I believe I'm on Tumblr at Sammy5436, but I haven't used that in at least a year. And you can find me at my business email, thetrapezoidtalks5436@gmail.com. Any information you need to send to those business emails will be looked at. I generally look at my business email on Wednesdays and Sundays, so just do be advised that I do not always have the ability to respond immediately, but if you do send an email to my business email, and as long as it's not offensive, I will respond if it's something I'm interested in with something positive, and if it's something I'm not interested in, I will thank you for your email and go ahead and say that there may be a future opportunity for us to collaborate if that's something you're interested in.